by the BC Construction Association. I'd like to acknowledge before we get going that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land we continue to this day. My name is Chris Atchison, and I'm the president of the BC Construction Association, and I'm pleased to be with you as your host for today's session, which is titled The Challenging State of BC's ICI Construction Sector. The BC Construction Association has been representing employers across BC's ICI construction sector for more than 50 years. Our advocacy initiatives and workforce development programs serve more than 10,000 contractors province-wide. Uniquely positioned in that we work for the productivity and resilience of all companies in our industry, regardless of size, location in the province, role, or labor affiliation, BCCA is the go-to source of information and guidance for BC's construction industry. Twice a year, we publish what we call our Stat Pack. These key data points show the size and influence and outlook for our sector. And we also publish annual results of our construction industry survey by taking the pulse of our industry, and we go behind the data to the issues, gathering and sharing the real-life perspective and experiences of contractors and the tradespeople who work for them. Combined, these studies demonstrate just how important the construction sector is to BC's economy. It aligns stakeholder partners across the industry. This year, and once again, for the second consecutive year, BCCA has commissioned a construction industry economic review from Sage Policy Group, an economic and policy consulting firm that specializes in the construction industry, to undertake an unbiased review of the economic and policy environment for our industry in British Columbia. They have been able to provide new insights and validation for the focus of our advocacy efforts on everything from prompt payment legislation through to workforce development challenges that are often unique to our province. Just before I formally introduce you to our presenter from Sage Policy Group and turn the mic over to him, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We'll take questions at the end, but feel free to put them into the Q&A section as they occur to you. The webinar will be recorded and made available through the BCCA website. And both this Sage Policy Group report and our Fall 2023 Stat Pack are available online on our website at bccassn.com. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Anirban Basu, founder, chairman, and CEO of Sage Policy Group, Inc. Dr. Basu is the chief economist of several construction industry organizations, including Associated Builders and Contractors and the Construction Financial Management Association. The Baltimore Business Journal named him one of the region's 20 most powerful business leaders in 2010. In 2022, he entered the Daily Record newspaper Circle of Influence. He is the distinguished economist in the residence at Goucher College, where he teaches history of economic thought. We're happy to welcome him once again to this forum to share his insights. Over to you, Dr. Basu.
Hey, thank you, Chris, and thanks, of course, to all the stakeholders here from the British Columbia Construction Association. My name is Anirban Basu. I am an economist. Please hold any further applause. And yes, for a second consecutive year, we were commissioned to do this study. There is a separate study, by the way. I'm going to present a PowerPoint here right now, which summarizes our key findings. And I think actually the presentation does a good job summarizing the study. Nonetheless, with a study, with a narrative, it's always possible to deliver more analysis, more data. And so if you're interested in going deeper into the material after this presentation, or even during the presentation, please know that there is a companion report to this PowerPoint that I'm going to deliver right now. Our report entitled The Market Analysis of British Columbia's Industrial, Commercial, and Institutional Construction Sectors. I'm going to try to provide as much data for you as I can in our time together and analysis. And of course, at the end of this, I will be ready to take your questions and hopefully deliver some decent answers. So let's begin. Let's talk about the macroeconomic overview. And one of the things that we conclude is that despite the fact that we are basically in year 3 of the recovery from the pandemic in North America economically, investment in buildings remains subdued. Now, how do we know that? Well, because we have the data. For instance, from Statistics Canada, So this is investment in ICI building construction, British Columbia. These data, it should be noted, are not adjusted for inflation. Now that is really, really key. It's in current dollars. So if it's adjusted for inflation, we'd call it constant dollars, but this isn't current dollars. And what you see here is if you look in current dollars, things don't look so bad. So the blue line at the top there, that's your commercial construction, things like office space, for instance. And what you see there, also retail space. What you see there is recovery in investment in building construction in that commercial category. So that doesn't look so bad, Anirban. Okay, we'll talk about that. We'll contextualize this further. That golden colored line at the middle there, that's your institutional government. And you say, okay, yeah, I mean, we've more than recovered above now pre-pandemic levels in terms of investment in building construction in that institutional government category. And then the brown line down below is industrial. You say, well, that's a bit weaker, at least in British Columbia. There are other parts of Canada in which, in fact, industrial construction has been quite strong, but in British Columbia, not so much. But overall, you look at this and say, hey, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Because in 2 of these 3 categories, you see either complete or near complete recovery or some growth, let's say, since the pre-pandemic levels of spending. But again, this is not adjusted for inflation. And that means that this is not adjusted for the costs or the additional costs borne by contractors to deliver these building construction services. This is Anirban. Why don't you provide us with some data that actually provides us with that inflation adjustment? That would be amazing if you did that. Here it is, constant dollars. So this is investment in ICI building construction, British Columbia. All these data are British Columbia, again, from Statistics Canada. But now this is in constant dollars. Now this is adjusted for inflation. And what you see here, if you look again, that blue line at the top, that's commercial construction. My goodness. Once you adjust for inflation, there's hardly been any recovery in commercial construction. So what the data seem to be indicating, we'll talk more about this in the slides ahead, is that to the extent that we have seen more investment in construction, it's not because the industry is delivering more service. It's because the industry is charging more for the services it's delivering. Now you say, well, that doesn't sound so bad, Anirban. Yeah, except that if the reason that the cost of delivering construction services is going up is because your costs are going up, your input costs, for instance, your materials costs or your labor costs, then your margins may actually be shrinking, even during a period of economic recovery. That gold card line there is institutional and government building construction investment. And you look at that and you say, well, now all of a sudden, once you adjust for inflation, it doesn't look so impressive, this recovery. No, it does not. And you can see, actually, if you go back 12 years, let's say back to 2011, in fact, once you adjust for inflation, investment in that institutional government category is less than it was 12 years ago. And if you look at the brown card line down below, that's industrial, the figures look even worse once you adjust for inflation. I mean, and look at the trajectory here. It's not positive. You look at the commercial trajectory, that blue colored line, it's not positive. You look at the trajectory in the industrial category, it's not positive in British Columbia. But again, the broader economy, Canada-wide, is in recovery. It's growing economically, but you would not know that based on these data, these inflation-adjusted data. Now, let me, in fact, move forward and simplify it still. So again, here I'm bundling together all 3 categories of building construction. So this is investment in ICI building construction, but now only 2 lines. The line in blue, that's not adjusted for inflation. So if somebody looked at that who didn't know any better, they said, my goodness, what are the contractors complaining about? We see fabulous investment in building construction. Yeah, there's been a fair amount of spending there. But if you adjust for inflation, you get that green cut line down below, and the industry is actually delivering less service. That is an indication that demand is pretty weak. Now, demand could be weak for a number of reasons. It could be because the British Columbia economy is not performing that well. It could be because the cost of construction services is now so high, the cost of delivering those services is now so high, that some would-be buyers of construction services are saying, I can't afford this. I'm not moving forward with this project. In either instance, it's not particularly great news. Now, I think one of the things you'd want to know is, well, okay, fine, spending is going up, but it is conceivable still at this point in this presentation that the reason that the cost of doing construction services is going up is not because our materials costs are higher, not because our wages are rising for our workers, but maybe, we're supporting higher profit margins. Well, let's investigate that further in the slides to come. So this is the Canadian Non-Residential Building Construction Price Index. And what this reflects is actually the cost of delivering a unit of construction services in the non-residential building categories. And what you see here, and we see this in the United States of America as well, and I'll talk about the US as well during this presentation, starting in early 2021, we see this spiraling inflation in both the United States and Canada. It's a North American phenomenon. Inflation takes off largely during the spring or the first quarter into the second quarter of 2021. So if you look at the caption toward the northeast corner of the slide, it says the cost of delivering construction services between the first quarter of 2020 and the third quarter of 2023 went up 23%. And so what that means is, for the most part, you have been, as a group of contractors in British Columbia, have been passing along your cost increase, the costs you face, to your customers. Now, last year we talked about the fact that this was a source of frustration for many of you, that many of your long-lived customers, your most loyal customers, have actually become upset because your bids have come in high relative to their expectations. And maybe their expectations have changed by this point in the cycle. But back then, some of you were telling me that actually your customers, again, loyal customers, friends of yours, people you've been working with for many, many years, were angry with you because your bids were coming in high. And I think that it was difficult for them to imagine how much your costs have gone up. And we want to explore why those costs have gone up throughout this presentation. So, again, if you look at unadjusted data, not adjusted for inflation data, it looks like it's been a pretty strong recovery in ICI activity. But once you adjust for inflation, you realize, my goodness, things have become more expensive to deliver. We're passing along our cost increases to customers. They don't like it. They might be buying less of our services as a result of that. And that's one of the reasons some of us are worried about the provincial industry. So, and again, at the heart of this is what's going on in the macroeconomy. So again, I mentioned that there was that burst of inflation in the spring of 2021. So if you look at, this is the Bank of Canada's target overnight lending rate, the rate at which banks can borrow from one another to shore up their reserves. And why would a bank borrow from another bank to shore up reserves? Because you need a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of the bank. So in America, we have the Fed funds target range. The Bank of Canada has its target overnight rate, but it's by and large the same thing. Now, again, that burst of inflation in North America becomes apparent during the spring of 2021. And both the central banks in Canada and the United States respond to that inflation in 2021 by doing basically nothing about it. Both of these central bankers or banks believe that inflation is transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think it's almost purely supply chain driven, that demand was coming storming out of the early stages of the pandemic as the economy is reopened in fits and starts, but that supply chains had been shut to varying degrees, workers had yet to be rehired, and so demand exceeded supply. That's inflationary. But the notion was that as supply chains became more fully operational, as workers were rehired, as employers were more fully staffed up, that supply side of the economy would meet the demand side of the economy. There'd be a conformity there, and that excess inflation would dissipate. Instead, what the central banks appear to have done is to preside over the creation of a wage price spiral. Now, you can see the impact of this in both Canada and the United States. Let me talk about some examples of the United States. So you probably know that, undoubtedly know that we've had some UAW strikes, United Auto Workers strikes in North America. Those strikes seem to have been resolved, but they translated into some pretty hefty wage increases for those UAW members over the next 4.5 years or so. We've had in Hollywood an actor's strike, a writer's strike. Some negotiations, by the way, did not end in strikes. Let me give you an example of negotiations between the Teamsters Union and UPS, United Parcel Service. So that negotiation produced a 5-year contract. During the 5th year of that contract, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 per annum US. Now that includes wages plus benefits, but it is $170,000 US per annum, forcing people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And based on the app, spectacular. And I do not begrudge those UPS truck drivers that kind of compensation. From an American context, they're very special people. They have to be able to park, they have to be able to drive in the first place, they have to be able to lift heavy objects as much as 70 pounds or more, and they have to be able to pass a drug test. Most Americans can't do all of those things. So I understand why they're being compensated so well, but that's inflationary. Now, it was actually the Bank of Canada that started to raise rates first. In early 2022, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States begins its rate hiking cycle in March of 2022, and you can see what's happened to interest rates. So here's the thing. For users of construction services, not only has the cost of purchasing construction services gone up for a variety of reasons we can get into, but their borrowing costs are higher, their project financing costs are higher, because the central banks in North America have been waging this war on excess inflation, trying to get back to a lower level of inflation. In the United States, for instance, back to that 2% target. So that's where we are, and none of this works particularly well for the typical British Columbia construction firm, and we want to talk about the implications for those firms throughout this presentation. Now, the other aspect of this is, what are those interest rate increases designed to do to slow economic growth? The Federal Reserve is trying to slow economic growth in America. The Canadian Central Bank of Canada, is trying to do the same thing in Canada. And you can see here, 2021, that very rapid recovery. That was when we saw that inflation manifest itself, that excess inflation. Then there's a bit of a softening in economic recovery after the initial stage of recovery from the pandemic in 2022. And then that gold-colored segment at the very end, that's your 2023 forecast for Canadian economic growth from the International Monetary Fund. But the economy is slowing. It is designed to slow based on those higher interest rates. So, that's where we are. So here's the point. Building construction, ICI activity, remains subdued once we're adjusted for inflation, even when the Canadian economy is growing quite rapidly. And now it's not growing quite rapidly, not so rapidly. And so, you look at this and say, my goodness, things should have been better, and they weren't. And we want to talk about why they weren't better and why they might get worse, as it turns out, including for reasons related to legislation. So let's talk about some more of the macroeconomy instances, or I should say circumstances, are more problematic in British Columbia than they are elsewhere in Canada. So this is employment in construction activities, 2 recent quarters, comparing the second quarter of 2023 against the first quarter of 2023. You can see that, in Ontario, for instance, and some other provinces, job growth, some job growth in construction. Employment, this is, again, the delta here is employment change, employment and construction change. But in British Columbia, during the second quarter of 2023, 14,500 construction jobs were lost. Now, why were they lost? Were they lost because activity was weak, or were they lost because those construction workers found better opportunities elsewhere in Canada or elsewhere, someplace else in the balance of the world? So, that's the question, but this is not a good outcome. And again, this relates more to the inflation-adjusted construction spending, because that's not where you see growth. So, if construction spending is growing because the price of delivering services is growing, that's not the kind of growth that generates demand for new employment. It's when the industry is delivering more service to users of construction services, that's when you need more workers. But you can see there that negative 14,500, and it really sets British Columbia apart from the rest of Canada, from the rest of the provinces. And we could actually break this employment down, this construction employment down by region. That's exactly what we've done here for you. So that blue line at the top there, and this is in 3-month moving average of British Columbia construction employment, that's the Lower Mainland. Obviously, that's where much of the activity is. This is in thousands, by the way. So if that's the axis toward the left, the numeric axis is in thousands. But obviously, Vancouver Metro, Lower Mainland, so on and so forth. And you look at that employment and say, Anirban, this is not that impressive. It's not impressive. Because what it says is that if you compare employment in the Lower Mainland versus where we were pre-pandemic, it's lower than it was back then. The Canadian economy has grown. It grew in 2021, grew in 2022. It's growing in 2023, not rapidly, but growing. But you wouldn't know that from construction employment in British Columbia. Now, if you look at the green colored line there down below, that's Vancouver Island. Look at the trend recently in Vancouver Island. That's not positive. The light blue colored line there is the interior, also not a positive trend in terms of construction employment in British Columbia. And then the red colored line, of course, is the north, sparsely populated, generally speaking, less construction activity for your workers, but it's flat. So there's no real good news there. At some point, I will give you good news during this presentation, by the way. I will, I promise. But when you look at these data, this is not positive. These are not indicators or indications of a growing construction segment. And at the heart of this again is what's happening on the demand side for construction services. Again, construction costs are higher. And when construction costs rise, or when any cost rises, I'm going to be less likely to purchase that thing. Look, for instance, in the United States at least, egg prices went much higher in 2022. Guess what? People bought fewer eggs. This year, people are buying more eggs because they're down 71% from that 2022 peak, that kind of thing. But again, construction costs are surging. And so when you put it together, those higher construction costs and the higher borrowing or project financing costs, that's not good for demand. So this is the construction unemployment rate in British Columbia. You say, Ani, but wait a second here. You just said the industry has been losing jobs. So why is the unemployment rate falling? Well, that's particularly problematic. Because what that says is that a lot of the people who are part of the construction workforce, for whatever reason, have left British Columbia. Now, they may not have left British Columbia. They may have simply retired. Or because we have a lot of construction workers in both the United States and Canada who are older. So if they retire, they're no longer part of the workforce. And they're no longer, therefore, if they're looking for work, they're no longer considered unemployed, because to be unemployed, you have to be actively looking for work. You look at this and you say, my goodness, wait a second, Anirban, this is the worst of all worlds, because we're not growing as an industry. Demand has stagnated in various segments, and we talked about those segments, the commercial segment as an example, also the industrial segment. And now, we're still struggling despite that weakness with workforce. We don't have enough skilled workers. We don't have enough workers generally in the British Columbia construction industry. That's exactly right. Well, won't that keep costs high? Yes, it will. Won't that further frustrate demand? Absolutely. Well, you said you're going to bring good news. I will. It's just not yet. Give me a few minutes, but I'll get there. I promise. I think that I have one or two slides that are positive. But setting that aside, that's the dynamic here. It's kind of a vicious cycle. I mean, here's the construction labor force, British Columbia, 1976 to 2022. And what you see here is that since the beginning of the pandemic, the people who are associated with British Columbia's construction workforce, that labor force, has shrunk. I mean, what's the good news, Anirban? The Canucks are awesome. Okay, the good news is the Canucks are awesome. They can't stop scoring goals. But that might be of, only some modest solace to, folks actually engaged in the industry that are trying to make something out of, their enterprises, right? They've started construction firms, they've invested in people, they've invested in equipment, they've invested in space, so on and so forth. They want to return on that investment, but it's hard when there are not enough workers to hire. Those workers are very, very expensive, may or may not be very, very productive. And when demand for services is not growing strongly. So, I mean, right now, here we are in 2023, ostensibly a year of economic recovery, but the British Columbia construction industry is not part of that recovery. At least, you look at these very broad data, none of these data are indicia of growth. And then on top of that, there's some additional challenges, including some legislative challenges. Again, the Canucks are great. So let's talk about some things here. Paid sick leave, prompt payment legislation, and high borrowing costs. Shall we? I guess we're just piling on here. So let's talk about paid sick leave. So as of January 1st, 2022, employers in British Columbia are required to provide at least 5 days of paid sick leave to any employee who has worked for the organization for at least 90 days. So yeah, they've put in their 3 months. They've been with you for 3 months, and now, you know what? I'm going to take 5 days of paid sick leave. I feel feverish. I feel ill. I'm a Canadiens fan. Whatever. I mean, set that aside. So, but now 90 days. That's the issue, isn't it? It's not that they've been with you for a year or 2 years. It's 90 days, and now they get to take 5 days of paid leave. That's an expense that you bear. You may bear, I should say. 5 days off, you pay for it, but you're not getting any output from that. And what does that do, by the way? It drives up the cost of you delivering construction services, again, rendering it less likely that somebody is going to actually pay for those services because they might find your price to be too high. Let's move on. Employers are required to pay their employees their regular wages on these days. The law applies to both full and part-time workers. So you work part-time for 90 days. So let's say the equivalent of 30 days, and now you get 5 days, sick leave. Congratulations. Not exactly the most pro-business legislation. This policy has further strained an industry already saddled with rising labor costs. And notice I spelled labor with a U there. So I fought against my American instincts. Acute worker shortages and severely elevated input prices. This policy exacerbates cost pressures on contractors, especially in the context of provincial construction wages rising significantly faster than nationwide construction wages in 2022. So here's the thing. Not only are you paying paid sick leave for these people who are not working, but because your wages are higher than in other provincial communities across Canada, it's costing you more to comply with this policy. Then there's also lack of prompt payment legislation. So on the one hand, you've got legislation that hurts you on the cost side. Then you've got a lack of legislation that hurts you on the revenue side. While several provinces recently enacted prompt payment legislation, British Columbia policymakers have not. According to BCCA's 2023 construction industry survey, 82% of contractors were paid late for work at least once, while more than a third of contractors were paid late more than a quarter of the time. So here you're dealing with having to pay for workers who may not be working, but you're not getting paid for delivering the work that you're delivering in some cases, at least not promptly. This must be a source of frustration. I'm an economist, it's true, but I'm also a small business owner. So what do I care about? I also care, as it turns out, about my accounts payable and my accounts receivable, my payroll, so on and so forth. Right? Those issues. I know I'm supposed to, as an economist, look down from 30,000 feet at the economy, and often I do. But at the end of the day, I make payroll every 2 weeks as well. And if my clients are not paying me, but I still have to pay my employees, including employees who are maybe not working because they're claiming to be sick, and maybe they are sick. Don't get me wrong, there's some honest people out there. But this opens the door to some perverse incentives, let's say. So let's continue with this concept of lack of prompt payment legislation. Ontario recently amended its law to require an owner to pay a contractor within 28 days of receiving an invoice. How nice. So if you're a contractor in Toronto or Hamilton, okay, your province passed that law. Alberta and Saskatchewan have also enacted prompt payment legislation in recent years, and similar efforts are ongoing in Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Manitoba. So this means that British Columbia is largely an outlier in terms of not having or not considering, at least not strongly considering, prompt payment legislation. At the federal level, legislation that would require prompt payment on federal construction projects received royal assent in 2019, but is not yet in force. So that might have helped, right? Federal legislation in that case, but it's not yet in force. Let's continue on with this lack of prompt payment legislation and its implications. The ongoing lack of prompt payment legislation poses several risks for British Columbia's construction industry. It forces contractors to raise their bid prices due to higher risk mitigation costs. Now, what have we said already? Your costs are already rising for a variety of reasons, including more expensive workers and also sick leave legislation, that kind of thing. And then on top of that, because you have to worry about whether you're going to be paid on time, you have to charge more for work so that when you get paid, it can compensate you for the fact that sometimes you're not paid promptly. And that further dilutes demand for your services. None of this works in your favor. None of this works to bolster your revenues and cut back on your costs. So obviously, again, raising your bid prices, increasing overall construction costs, and ultimately diminishing the volume of investment. And that's exactly what you see in the data I showed you at the front of the presentation. Again, commercial, institutional, so on and so forth. As other provinces pass their own prompt payment legislation, British Columbia is at a growing disadvantage in terms of attracting additional firm formation. That's right. So if you're thinking about starting a construction firm in Canada, would you start in British Columbia? Well, maybe because you're tied to Victoria or you're tied to Vancouver, whatever. Yes, maybe. But if you're objective and you can be wherever you want to be, maybe it's Ontario, maybe it's Alberta, someplace else. So that's where we are. And here's the issue. I mean, some people might say, well, yeah, but I'm not part of the construction industry. Why should I care? And I live in British Columbia. I work in British Columbia, but I'm not part of the construction segment. I don't really care. Yes, you do care. You should care because you have to improve your built environment. The economy is changing. The built environment has changed with it to accommodate population, to accommodate new industries. So if the built environment doesn't change, if it stagnates, that's problematic from the perspective of economic growth and economic dynamism. Entrepreneurs want to be part of dynamic economic environments. High borrowing costs, of course, another issue. The Bank of Canada has raised its benchmark overnight rate to 5%. I showed you that. With inflation running at a 4% annual rate as of August of 2023, further rate increases remain a distinct possibility. Now, in America, we've gotten some really benign inflation data recently. The stock market has been booming here. And the notion is that our central bank is done raising interest rates. That may prove to be right, may prove to be wrong. Canadian inflation seems to be a bit stickier. And so we'll see. But again, even if the Bank of Canada does not raise rates any further, they're already high enough to suppress future economic growth. So, with rates this high, the Canadian economy and therefore the construction economy is fragile. High borrowing costs will continue to exacerbate the effects of elevated construction costs. There's a magnification or amplification effect, meaning that an increasing share of project owners are likely to be reluctant to move forward with projects given both high construction delivery costs and elevated costs of financing or financial capital. So I have to finance these high delivery costs, and financing that is more expensive as well. And then, when you consider this macroeconomic backdrop, and then you compare this or you relate this to the microeconomics or firm level data, and you can see a real problem here. There are already problems in macroeconomically. But then when you think about the structure, the nature, the characteristics of the typical ICI contractor, things get even stickier. So according to research supplied by the British Columbia Construction Association, the typical contractor operating in British Columbia is relatively small. 92% of construction companies in British Columbia employ 20 workers or fewer. So they are smallish in many cases, and they're also young, and therefore quite fragile financially and otherwise. According to these same data, the typical contractor has less than a decade of experience. The median contractor has been operating for only 5 to 10 years, and therefore is often fragile financially and otherwise, meaning they have a lack of demonstrated experience in their corporate resume. So it's harder for them to line up new work, to build backlog. That typical contractor is also concerned about skilled labor shortages, 50% of contractors. Yes, of course. And, again, I showed you the labor force actually shrinking in size in British Columbia. It's concerned about the lack of a provincial prompt payment policy, 50%. Has been paid late for work completed, 82%. Have said, we've been paid late. Again, you're expected to pay your bills on time, but then you get paid late. And has seriously contemplated leaving the industry, 61% of small contractors. Now that is an issue that should matter to people who are not part of the construction industry. Because directly or indirectly, they consume construction services, whether it's to build a new school building or add to a university or to build a new, the new visitation hotspot in Victoria, whatever it happens to be. And so, again, none of this works for anybody. So in conclusion, real investment in ICA structures in British Columbia is nearly 14% below the all-time high attained in late 2019. So that's a real investment. I want to be clear. Real investment means inflation-adjusted investment. Okay, inflation-adjusted investment in ICA structures is down 14%. Despite stagnant demand, contractors continue to struggle to find workers. And again, in part, that's because the construction workforce has shrunk in British Columbia. Half of BCCA members indicated concern regarding worker shortages. Pressures applied by higher wages and still elevated materials prices are severely exacerbated by the province's lack of a prompt payment policy, because you're taking out all kinds of costs for your workers, your payroll, and materials prices, which have been coming down in some instances recently in North America. That's true. Materials prices are not rising the way they were a couple of years ago. Absolutely true, but they're still elevated relative to historic norms, relative to pre-pandemic levels. So that puts a lot of pressure on your balance sheets. And until British Columbia catches up legislatively with the balance of Canada regarding such policymaking, provincial contractors will continue to struggle with outsized financial risk and be more likely to falter. And there's some evidence that it's already an industry with some diminished capacity to deliver construction services, and there continue to be risks out there. And so, in any case, that's my presentation. Again, I have to conclude. I mean, the big picture story here is, and the most important aspect is, the Canucks are awesome. But some of the construction data are not so positive, and so that is of concern. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and we can go to Q&A if you'd like.
Thanks, Anirban. Just like to open up the floor to any of our guests who have joined us to any questions. I think that what's the good news in all of this? Like I think that we're hearing that there is there's some economic challenges that we're facing in the current legislative process. That the inflation is kind of suppressing the real investment that's required to kind of grow the sector. But where in this are we able to thread the needle and find that there is some positivity on the horizon if things change? Do you have any comment on that?
Oh, sure, Chris, of course. I mean, I think that over the last 2 years, the story of the industry and its struggles, its challenges, has become so compelling that there's a really strong story to put forth to legislators who, previously have basically ignored these issues, not taking the industry particularly seriously. I mean, look, in other provinces, you can see that policymakers have taken the industry seriously. They have passed prompt payment legislation. They've done that. They've said, yeah, this is a challenge for our construction community. We want to support our construction community. We want to improve our built environment. We have to have the capacity to improve our built environment. We have to change with the times. Economies are changing very dynamically. The built environment has to change with that, with the economic structure, the economic makeup, the composition. And we're just not doing that in British Columbia the same way for various reasons. And so I think the story is so compelling here. That's my perspective, that maybe policymakers at this point, once they're told the story, and maybe they have to be told the story again and again and again, have to do something about this. Again, who's benefiting from this? I mean, who benefits from a lack of prompt payment legislation? People who are not operating very well, right? People who are in some sense dishonest because they said, I'm going to pay you in a timely fashion, and then they don't do it. Who wants to structure public policy around the interests of those people? I don't understand. Wouldn't you want to structure public policy around small businesses in many cases, newish businesses, helping, to sow investment into the community? I would think so. Those are the good guys and gals. And so I think, again, the story is so compelling that there is change in the air. And my hope is that if this story is told well, that in fact we'll see some prompt payment and other supportive legislation coming out of the British Columbia legislature.
Great. We've got a question that just came in from an anonymous attendee, but can you expand on the cost to build tagged at 23%? And could that drop?
Oh, sure, it can drop. So can I expand on that? So, if you think about your construction production function, what goes into delivering construction services? Number of things. Obviously, there's skilled human capital. They're your trade workers. In whatever industry you're in, whether it's painters or carpenters or roofers or drywall hangers or millwrights or whomever they happen to be, there's that. There's, of course, the cost of management and administration of a project, right? The finance, making sure that the numbers are right, the financials are right, so on and so forth. There is a cost of materials, whether it's steel or natural gas or, softwood lumber, whatever it happens to be, there's that cost as well. There's the cost of equipment. Now, the cost of equipment has risen a lot in recent years because we've had all kinds of equipment challenges and shortages, so on and so forth. Contractors have basically been competing with one another for scarce equipment, whether it's HVAC equipment. I mean, anytime I speak to a mechanical contractor, they're very quick to remind me about their lead times to acquire switchgear and generators, that kind of thing. So all of these things contribute to that production function. All of these things contribute to that cost function. So when equipment prices are rising, materials prices are rising, and again, they're not rising as rapidly as they were. When the cost of human capital is rising, workers are rising, that feeds into that 23%. So it's an amalgam of all these different inputs to production. And things have gotten more expensive generally in the economy, and so you see that in that 23% number.
Great. Here's a question that's just come in from Ronan. Am I understanding that owners have less money to invest relative to a similar/growing desire to invest? Contractors' pricing reflects the reality of inflation, whereas investor money has really taken this into account.
Yeah, that's the issue, right? Because in many cases, and again, this came out loud and clear last year during our discussions, many contractors said, look, we're not trying to charge excessively for our services, but our costs have gone up massively for a variety of reasons. And just the wage bill just keeps rising, right? I mean, this is a time when labor is flexing its muscles. Not saying that's a good or bad thing. That's for people to decide. But those costs are rising, and so the buyers of construction services have become accustomed historically to paying a certain amount for every unit of construction service purchased. But now those costs have gone way up. So now, as a purchaser of construction services, as a developer, let's say, of office space or commercial space, whatever it happens to be, retail space, that kind of thing. I look around and say, my goodness, does my pro forma work out? Because when I go to the bank, I'm borrowing money and it's costing me more to borrow money. My cost of capital is higher overall. And now I'm having to finance more costs of construction because the world has changed. Now, I can argue with the contractor. I can argue with the people supplying me business saying, you're overcharging me. And I can try to drive down their margins, drive down their prices. And I probably will try to do that. But at the end of the day, the contractor can only do so much because their costs, in fact, have gone up. That's a reality. And so at the end of the day, you don't have anyone who's happy as part of this transaction, right? The buyer of construction service is frustrated by high prices and high financing costs. The seller is frustrated because their costs have gone up, and that some of their would-be buyers are not buying their services because they're priced out of the market at this point. So, you put it all together, it speaks to a stagnant or worse market for construction services, and that's exactly what the data indicate is occurring in British Columbia, at least again in these ICI categories.
Ronan also has a follow-up question about who supports West Ham and Chelsea.
That's a very good question. This is one of the aspects of being married. So my wife knows I love English football, and I love West Ham. I'm Hammer Time all the time. The team actually was born as the Thames Iron Works. So these are iron workers out of East London. So I don't know why I don't look like an iron worker out of East London. Look at me. I look like an economist from Baltimore. But the point is, I just fascinated by that history and the bubbles. I don't know if you know how they celebrate goals and that kind of thing. I hate Chelsea. But my wife, thinking that I love English soccer, bought me an English a Chelsea pennant. And because she's my wife and I choose to remain married, I had to hang it up. So I dislike Chelsea very much. I tend to look at the West Ham pennant and try to look askew or askance at Chelsea. I cannot stand the West Londoners. They're arrogant, and I have nothing to do with them.
Okay, we'll try to get this back on track for a few more questions, but appreciate the the sidebar discussion, and we like our sports anyway. The question I'm going to ask now is around the role that you might be seeing as an economist that immigration into both the United States and Canada can play. Both jurisdictions are being quite aggressive in attracting or looking to attract in our country new Canadians. And that's going to require policy reform, legislative reform to recognize credentials, to attract the talent that we need for respective sectors, including construction. I'd just be interested in your perspective on how that necessity is going to change the face of the economy, and in this case, the construction economy.
This is a fascinating question because, in fact, this is one of these public policy areas in which the nations actually diverge quite significantly. In fact, the Americans, under the last two presidents, have stiff-armed legal migration. We've tended to issue fewer visas, so on and so forth, dealing with the undocumented migration on our southern border, which has become a major political hot button in the United States. But both Presidents Trump and Biden have tended to want to de-emphasize legal migration, believing that faster immigration, legal migration to the United States would undercut workers. And certainly the Biden administration has been working along those lines. So now in Canada, of course, immigration has been much more aggressive. Visa issuance has been much more aggressive, and that's helped to drive fairly rapid Canadian population growth in certain communities. And I see that. I see that with the I'm an Indian American, but I see this with the Indian community, Canadian community, whether in Toronto or elsewhere, right? In Toronto, it's hard not to bump into an Indian Canadian, even if you try to avoid them. But so the point is this: The question is this, Chris, who is actually coming? And do they work in construction? Because at least when I look at the Indian Canadian community, what I notice, the people who are coming seem to be auntie and uncle. And often auntie and uncle are in their 70s, and they're not working in construction. Right. So I think one of the things we might do if we ever do a subsequent analysis on your behalf is to look at the nature of immigration in Canada, who's coming, what industries are they working in, are they working at all? Are they part of the labor force? And how that is augmenting the British Columbia workforce. That, it's quite a rapid immigration in Canada, at least relative to the United States. I would love to analyze that. It's just hard to figure out from some of the data, but I think it's something that should be investigated. But clearly, even with that step up of immigration, I showed you the data on British Columbia's construction labor force, and it's not growing, which at least provides some indication that a lot of these immigrants are not associated with the British Columbia construction industry.
Great. This next question, you might have a perspective on, and if not, I can probably refer back to our recent stat pack as well. But what is the government plan for infrastructure projects in the next year, more or less? Just at a very high level, I know that in our recent stat pack, the number of intended projects came down from about 220 billion down to around 170 billion that are being forecast. And we use both the BC statistics for that, as well as the major projects inventory that we look at through Infrastructure BC. So there's, but I don't know if you have any other comments on that, Anirban?
Well, here's the thing. This is another area in which the Americans and the Canadians seem to be diverging, because, of course, the Americans, despite higher borrowing costs, are investing a ton of money into infrastructure. On November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That was a $1.2 trillion infrastructure act, $550 billion of new money. Then in August of 2022, President Biden signs the Inflation Reduction Act, which is largely on alternative energy, a green energy kind of act. And then also in August of 2022, he signs the Chips and Science Act, which is designed to bring more supply chain back to the United States, including computer chip manufacturing facilities. So in America, we have about $250 billion of computer chip manufacturing facilities under development. That's Sherman, Texas, Chandler, Arizona, Syracuse, New York, Columbus, Ohio, which is booming, by the way, thanks to, in part, because of Intel and its anticipated investments. Right. You've got $40 billion in American battery manufacturing plants under development, US dollars. Georgia, Tennessee. In Canada, because the Canadians do not, and in some sense cannot take on the kind of debt that the US government takes on, and with borrowing costs higher for governments, public financing is under pressure. And so with higher borrowing costs, what you would anticipate is that the public sector would pull back on borrowing, not engage in as much borrowing, and therefore not engage in as much public construction finance. And that's exactly what you see in the data. So again, the United States, the US government is willing to run massive deficits, $33 trillion national debt here. We're going to get ourselves into trouble at some point. So in the 2020s, we're going to spend a ton on infrastructure. We might spend very little in the 2030s, as it turns out, because we're marching towards fiscal crisis. Canada, very different policymaking in Ottawa. And so I think what you're starting to see is some of that support for economic recovery is starting to wane given fiscal realities. And again, the high cost of capital.
And based on what you're saying about the American infrastructure, what impact is that likely to have if it goes unmatched or unchecked in Canada in terms of demand for supply, demand for labor? Is there a threat of the imbalance just causing a great sucking noise down to the States in terms of material and labor?
You could imagine that there would be a giant sucking sound. Now, I don't know if people remember the name Ross Perot, who ran for the US presidency in 1992, but the notion was there was this giant sucking sound into Mexico as more and more jobs left for Mexico. This is different, right? Because what's happening here is we're talking about some of these communities like a Columbus, Ohio, a Syracuse, New York, because Micron Technologies, which is based in Boise, Idaho, is set to invest billions of dollars in the Syracuse area. If you're living in, Nova Scotia or wherever, New Brunswick or Ontario, is not very far to Syracuse, New York. And all of a sudden, you're going to have all of these jobs for engineers and technologists there because of all this investment. it largely financed by U.S. federal government tax credits. And so, yeah, could you, see the movement away from Canada and toward the United States of technology workers, people like engineers and software programmers, developers, and the like? Absolutely. I mean, the Americans are working to compete against the Chinese, right, along the dimensions of computer chips and batteries and alternative energy and electric vehicles, so on and so forth. And that competition is taking place between these two massive economies. And the Chinese are winning some of these battles, the Americans others, but the Canadians sitting there to the north, are watching this and saying, my goodness, the Americans are investing all this money, and that's going to promote some migration perhaps out of Canada. So how do you compete with Boise, Idaho, where Micron Technologies is based, or Chandler, Arizona? Canada has to also match it, the Americans at some level with its own investment in supply chain and infrastructure, so on and so forth, to create that dynamism. To the extent that British Columbia is not doing that, then of course that makes that economy that much more vulnerable to out-migration of highly skilled professionals and technology workers to the US. And so, yeah, that's another reason for there to be greater urgency about prompt payment legislation and other things that can sort of revive this investment environment.
Yeah, I think that segues really well into this next question from Lyle. I'm just going to skip over Katie's for the time being, but and it sort of plays into that same theme with projects such as Trans Mountain Pipeline, Site C. The other one is the LNG Canada or Coastal Gas Link in terms of going past peak construction phase. As they're ending, what effect will this have or could it have on the current situation and outlook as people are coming off those projects?
Chris, I realized quite late in my career that construction activity is not necessarily just a function of economic growth. That's part of it. But what it really is a function of is economic transformation. And shale gas and liquefied natural gas exports from North America, all these things are a function of that economic transformation. And when the economy is transforming, of course, you have demands on the built environment, the need to change the built environment. But what you get at the end of the day from these transformations are these mega projects, very large scale projects. And it's great for contractors while they're occurring. But once they end, and if they're not replaced with another generation of mega projects, what you have, you've got contractors there who've been working, who staffed up, who took on a lot of costs, who leased a lot of equipment, maybe bought some equipment, leased space, whatever it happens to be, loading docks, whatever it happens to be. And now they're stuck with these fixed costs, or often fixed costs, but they don't have the countervailing revenue. And that's what creates often firm failure. And again, a lot of these firms are pretty young and they're pretty small. And these mega projects have supported them, fantastic, but you need another generation of mega projects to keep them busy. And again, when interest rates go higher, it's hard to finance mega projects, right? They're very expensive. Lots of capital is needed, financial capital, but financial capital is very expensive these days. And by the way, I haven't pointed this out, but bankers in both the United States and Canada are more defensive right now. They're nervous. So it's hard, not always as capital becomes more expensive, it's become more difficult to access. So you put all that together, that's a source of the vulnerability here. Now, if I was a British Columbia legislator, I'm thinking about these smaller firms or just construction industry generally, even the larger firms. I'm saying, I want to maintain this capacity. I want to maintain this capacity to alter my built environment so I can keep up with the Americans and the rest of the world. I better pass prompt payment legislation. I better rethink paid sick leave legislation, because otherwise these firms are going to disappear and it's going to be hard for the next generation to form. So in any case, again, the story is very compelling here, Chris.
Yeah, great. No, thank you. Thank you for that. A question from Andrew. Do you have any insight into construction productivity growth?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. I mean, and the unfortunate thing is that we don't see any. Construction has been famous or infamous for the lack of productivity growth over the last decade. So certain industries have become very productive: manufacturing, retail trade, banking, right? Because we now have ATMs when we used to have tellers. We now have self-checkout. You can now order a meal by a barcode, this kind of thing, right? So these are productivity enhancing innovations because you can now generate more output per hour worked. But in construction, you don't see the same thing. The construction job site, whether in the United States or Canada, looks very much like it did several decades ago. And so and there's only so much automation that can take place. A lot of these things are still labor intensive, bricklaying, that kind of thing. So at the end of the day, painting. So at the end of the day, what can I tell you? That's another reason why contractors have such difficulty, because they're not necessarily a lot of productivity. Part of this is also generational, by the way, because many of our most productive workers, construction workers, have been baby boomers, right? These people who brought their A game to the job site each and every day, who refined their craft, over the course of decades, and who were thankful for their jobs because they often saw their parents struggle, whether during the Great Depression or whatever it happened to be. Younger workers are different in their attitudes, right? They don't seem as thankful for their jobs. I mean, they seem almost resentful. I mean, I think they say to themselves, look, I just want, I want good meals, nutritious food, organically grown, obviously. I want a nice place to live. I want, to be able to see Beyonce concerts and Taylor Swift concerts. I want to take an occasional vacation to, to Cabo, maybe to Switzerland, something like that. I want a nice, very, very nice vehicle, that kind of thing. I just want that. I don't want more than that. I'm not asking for much. You're going to make me work for that? So, in America, at least last year, we had this term of art that was born called quiet quitting, which is you do just enough work to keep your job, but no more than that. Well, if that's the attitude of younger workers, and I'm stereotyping here, but I'm doing so accurately, so it's okay. If that's the attitude, how much productivity growth are you going to see, Chris?
Yeah.
So I think that's where we are. Now, I'll tell you one group that's very motivated. And it gets back to another issue we talked about just a moment ago, immigrants. Right? Immigrants to North America are very motivated, right? They're trying to build a new life. And again, one outstanding question that I have not researched yet is, to what extent is that that immigrant population coming into Canada, what proportion of that is relevant to construction? And to the extent that they're relevant to construction, that probably is actually lifting productivity. But I need to research that.
Yeah. I'm just cognizant of time, and I'm going to position this last question for you because it is one that's rooted in your expertise as an economist. So interest rates are the highest they've been in decades, and you touched on the persistent nature of inflation in Canada. What do you anticipate will be the impact for the industry if the central banks maintain these elevated interest rates longer than anticipated?
Chris, I've been predicting for a few months now that recession is coming to North America. Because my feeling, when I was in graduate school studying economics, I emerged as a monetarist, right? I mean, I read, I was fascinated most by the writings of Milton Friedman, the godfather of monetary theory, and Anna Schwartz, the godmother of monetary theory, who taught us, among other things, that monetary policy operates with long and variable lags. In other words, when the Federal Reserve or Bank of Canada raises interest rates, the effect of that may not show up in the economy for 2 years or more. So my belief is that a lot of the impact of these rate increases engineered by our two central banks have yet to permeate the economy. And that because inflation remains stubbornly above their target level of inflation, in part because of high wage growth, that they're going to have to maintain interest rates higher for longer. And as they do that, that's going to wear away at this existing economic momentum. And eventually, there will be a downturn economically in North America. Now, there are a lot of economists, other economists who have dropped their recession forecast. Economists at JP Morgan, Bank of America, so on and so forth. So please understand, I'm a pessimist relative to most other economists. I'm from Baltimore. I'm a pessimist. But the leading indicators I look at, and again, being a monetarist tells me when you raise interest rates at the fastest pace in more than 4 decades in North America, it's going to produce a recession. So I think the worst is still in front of us, especially if the predicate of that question proves true. Interest rates are going to stay higher than currently anticipated.
Great. Well, I have to say thank you because of the time you've spent with us and the information you've imparted. I'd like to say thank you for more good news coming our way, but I can say thank you for the report that Sage Policy Group has provided, and for the insight that you've lent to us and our guests today on this webinar. So, Anirban, thank you very much on behalf of the BC Construction Association. This is invaluable information for us as an industry. for us as an association, and really as we continue on with our advocacy with the provincial government and our partners nationally to the federal government. This is really critical information for us to have, and we appreciate you being a partner in this information for us.
Thank you, Chris. One other thing, where we see a lot of inflation, number of goals scored by the Vancouver Canucks.
We'll take that. We'll take that level of inflation for sure.
That's good. That's good.
Again, thank you so much for your time. I just want to again thank all of our guests for dialing in today. We will make this information available to a broader cross section of industry, as well as we have recorded the information. So thanks again to Dr. Anirban Basu, and thanks everyone for their time today. Thank you very much.